Well, hi everybody. Here is the first video recording of many lectures for the year, and this revolves around the steps of the scientific method. As you can see on this initial slide, all the steps are listed out in order and in the way that you need to know them, and we're going to discuss that quite thoroughly today. So the scientific method. What is it? Well, it does involve a series of steps, as you just saw, that are used to investigate a natural occurrence. So here we go. Let's take a closer look at these steps and the terminology that you need to know and understand before you embark on a variety of science projects for the year. So the scientific method imparts a number of steps, as I've said. First being the problem or question. In your world, you're going to notice that there are many problems that you can turn into a question, which might spur you to want to design some sort of an experiment to test and find out whether or not the answers that you derive in your head are to be true. Then you would make some observations and do research and become an expert on whatever particular problem area you're looking at. You'd formulate a hypothesis, which is in fact also an educated guess based on your research and the problem. Design a detailed experiment that not only yourself could follow, but somebody else could do if they so chose, within a detailed list of materials. You would collect and analyze your results. You collect what we call data, put it into an organized data table, and then analyze the data using graphs, pictures, or any other means that you feel would work. Then you would come to a conclusion. Your conclusion wraps up your entire experiment, allowing others to see how things turned out. We use the CEI format, which is the claims, evidence, and interpretation. And as we talked about in class when we were talking about close reading, when we say something, we want to be sure that we become a credible resource or a credible person when we make a statement because we're using our data or facts to back up our reasoning. And then finally, you communicate your results to the appropriate groups of people. So let's begin with the problem or the question. You're going to develop a question or a problem or notice a problem and realize that possibly you might just be able to solve this problem through experimentation. You'll make observations of the problem that you have encountered, and then it will spur you, or it should spur you, to do research to become an expert. And then the next step would be what? Can you remember at this time? How about formulating a hypothesis? Formulating a hypothesis is making an educated guess or a prediction of an answer to the problem or question that you have. Real important for our purposes, especially for the Regents exam, is that you use some certain terms. If is one, then is another, and the third one is because. So here's my example. If soil temperatures rise, then plant growth will increase. So let's say I come up with a problem. My problem is that I'm trying to bake a cake and I've run out of sugar. So I'm asking myself, I really, really want to have a cake, but I don't have anything to sweeten the cake batter with. Is it possible that I could use some other form of a sweetener? So possibly I pick maple syrup. So I'm going to ask myself this question. If I use maple syrup in my cake batter, then it will taste the same as if I use sugar, because both sugar and maple syrup are sweet. So it's as simple as that, but yet very important to include. Next, I'm going to design my experiment. And this is really crucial piece of the scientific method. You want to develop and follow a procedure. That procedure must be numbered. You must include the numeration in order for somebody else to come along and redo your experiment and come up with the same data that you did. You also need to come up with a detailed materials list. So for my example of the cake recipe, I don't have any sugar and I want to use maple syrup. I just can't say I'm going to use maple syrup. I have to say I'm going to use a cup of maple syrup. Now, once I've designed my experiment, I have to be sure that my outcome or my data that I'll be collecting is measurable or quantifiable. Collecting and analyzing results. Once I've collected my data, I'm going to organize it in a data table, and then I'll make my analyzation. And this is where you look at it and you go, this is really not coming out the way I thought, that I need to make some modifications. So it is, again, another very important step to a successful experiment. Finally, you'll confirm your results here by retesting. You're not going to do this just one time. A valid experiment, as you learned this summer, has many trials. Your conclusion, as I previously mentioned, is going to be written using the claims, evidence, and interpretation method. You'll be able to make a claim, use your data to back up your claim, and then interpret what you think was going to happen or did happen in your conclusion using that data and claim. It's not encouraged, or even it's strictly frowned upon to say my hypothesis was correct or my hypothesis was incorrect. As we talked about with the close method of reading, you need to back up your statements or what you're saying with data, something that is concrete and doesn't just become a form of opinion. This removes any type of bias in an experiment. Your conclusion may also make recommendations for someone for further study and improvements to the procedure if need be. Finally, you're going to communicate your results to the pertinent audiences, and you should expect that you may get questions. So, at this time, do you think you could name all 7 of these steps? And these are not listed in any particular order. Problem and question, observation and research, formulating a hypothesis, experimentation, collecting and analyzing your results, conclusion, communicating your results. How well did you do? All right, so now let's put the knowledge that you have of the scientific method to a realistic but simple example, hoping that you'll be able to understand everything that we've discussed. So here's the problem. John watches his grandmother bake bread. So he asks his grandmother, what is it that makes the bread rise? She explains that it's actually a process called fermentation, where the yeast releases a gas as it is feeding on the sugar. Those gas bubbles get trapped in the dough, and as it bakes, they pop, and that's what leaves your bread quite airy. So John wonders if the amount of sugar used in the recipe affects the size of the bread loaf. And that is his problem or question. So here's a little English lesson. You need to be careful how you use the terms effect and affect. Effect is usually a noun. Affect is a verb. The effect of sugar amounts on the rising of the bread. Or how does sugar affect the rising of bread? The second one statement there sounds much better. So John now does some research on baking and fermentation and comes up with a way that he could possibly test this question. Keeps all of his information, on this particular topic in his journal, and you're going to keep yours in your graphing composition notebook. So at this time, many scientists use what's called an experimental design diagram. You can get one of these if you would like. I can put the link on the blog if it's something that many of you feel that you would need. But quite frankly, I think just following the steps and writing it out yourself, you'll be organized enough in your composition notebook. So, formulating a hypothesis. After talking with his teacher and conducting further research, he then comes up with his hypothesis. If more sugar is added, then the bread will rise higher. The hypothesis is, again, an educated guess about the relationship between independent and dependent variables. These should sound somewhat familiar. Do you know the difference right now between the independent and dependent variable? Your independent variable is that which you as the scientist manipulates. It is what's changed. And you're intentionally changing this because you want to see how it affects the data or the outcome. And John, in this case, is changing the amounts of sugar. The dependent variable is that which is dependent or responding or the data you collect and changes because of your changes to the independent variable. In John's case, it is going to be the size of his bread. His teacher helps him come up with the procedure. Again, it must be very detailed and a list of detailed materials, certain amounts. Next, we're going to need to discuss that control group. Why would you have a control group? Well, you need to have a standard for comparison, and that is exactly what the role of the control group. If you don't have that control group, you have nothing to compare where your variable to see if that, in fact, has made some kind of a change. So the control group has no treatment. It isn't subjected to the experimenter's changes. It's exposed to the same conditions except for the variable. All experiments must have a control group. So because the grandmother always used 50 grams of sugar, that's what John's control group is going to be. Now, constants are a little bit different. Constants are all the other factors that you're going to keep the same, so that you can be sure that there's only one thing that's in variation or one thing you're testing. So everything in John's experiment is being kept the same except for the sugar. The constants in an experiment are all the factors that the experimenter, as I already said, keeps the same. Can you think of some constants for this particular experiment at this time? Well, here's some examples, like the other ingredients: flour, salt, water. Also maybe the oven that you use. You can't cook in 3 different kinds of ovens. The rising time needs to all be the same. The brand of every ingredient needs to be the same. The cook time, the pan, the air temperature, and so on and so forth. John writes out his procedure for his experiment along with the materials in his composition notebook or journal, and that's exactly the same thing that you'll be doing. Then you will bring these to me and I will check them and discuss any safety concerns that maybe I have. Your trials, as I already previously mentioned, trials are crucial. You need to carry out the experiment a minimum of 3 times. And this is to ensure that each time you're collecting data to give yourself an average. Collecting and analyzing the results, John comes up with a table that he can use to record his data. Gets his materials together and carries out the experiment. Here's the data that he collects. You can see here on the left-hand side is the independent variable, the amount of sugar. And on the right-hand side is the average size of the loaves of bread. And you can see that he conducted the experiment 3 times and collected data. And at this time, it's obvious which loaf of bread and how much sugar is the largest. John examines his data and notices that the control worked the best, but that's not really, there's not that significant of a difference with more than 100 grams of sugar. So he goes back to the drawing board and rejects his hypothesis and decides to retest, narrowing that independent variable field from 50 to 100 grams. He does the same thing again, collects his materials, carries out the experiment, and the results are as follows. And again, as you can see which, 50 grams looked like it worked the best the first time around. But in fact, when he narrowed that area between 50 to 90 grams of sugar, it's actually the 70 grams of sugar that works the best. So, as I said, John finds that 70 grams of sugar produces the largest loaf, and his hypothesis is accepted. John tells his grandmother about his findings, because that's his audience, and prepares to present his project in science class, which is also something that you will possibly do throughout the year. So, I encourage you to practice what you know. Observe your world. Begin to think about questions or come up with questions that you wouldn't mind having answered using the scientific method. So this is the end of the first video. Be sure that you answer the survey questions underneath. Thanks.